Okay, so we will begin the share for Chanukah, the Halachos of Chanukah. Primarily, we're going to be looking at some of the sources of the Gemara and Shabbos and understand some of the relevant halachas that we have, as well as some of the ideas that come up that aren't particularly or that aren't directly in the Gemara, but what we can learn from it. So the Gemara tells us, the Gemara in Shabbos 21b, Taner Rabbanan, mitzvahs Chanukah ner ishubeso. So the interesting idea about Chanukah, that it's a unique mitzvah in that the Gemara tells us it is a mitzvah that is not only on the person, which is typically the way we look at a mitzvah. Our mitzvah is on a person to do the particular mitzvah. But here, the structure of this mitzvah is not only on the person, but ner ish ubeso. It is also a mitzvah on the household, and this has halachic ramifications. The mitzvah is on the household, and therefore, if someone is not home for that particular evening, but there are some people home, then there's a mitzvah for the home to have a menorah lit there, even if they're not going to make it home that day. As we'll see later in the Gemara about someone who is a guest at another place, how to deal with that. So there's a mitzvah particularly to have a menorah lit in the house itself. There's a mitzvah on the bias. So it's in that way, it's similar to, think of mezuzah, right? It's a mitzvah for the home, but it was structured for the people of the home. Ner ish ubeso. So there's this duplicate mitzvah, or the structure of the mitzvah is in two aspects. A mitzvah for the home to have a menorah lit, and then there's a mitzvah on the person. And that's relevant for a person who is not at home, who is traveling, that they would also, if they're not going to be home that day and there's no one lighting in their home, they have to light where they will be. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the halachos of achsanai, of someone who is a guest. Additionally, this also has ramifications because the structure of the mitzvah is ner ish ubeso, a person and their home. So if someone doesn't have a home for that night, or doesn't have a home at all, so then they would be exempt of the mitzvah of lighting the menorah. And rather, they would say the bracha of a ro'eh, someone who sees the candles, and they don't say the bracha for lighting the candle, but they will say the bracha for she'asa nisim lavasenu, the second bracha that one would say when lighting. That bracha she'asa nisim lavasenu, they will say even when if they don't have a home, but they do see it. So this is a traveler, someone who is traveling from one place to another that doesn't have their own space. If somebody's traveling on a train and they have their own room or their own space, then they would be included in this mitzvah. And then that room, there's a great chuvos that a lot of chuvos that have been written about this topic, about lighting when you're traveling, and you would light in your room where you are, as if you have your designated space on a train. But generally, people don't have that designated space. You just pick a seat, or you're traveling in a car overnight throughout the night, so you don't have a place to light. You would be exempt of lighting the menorah because you don't have a bias, you don't have a home. But if you see a menorah, then you would make the bracha a birchas haroeh, the bracha for one who sees it, and the bracha, that's the second bracha, she'asa nisim lavasenu bayamim hahem hazman. The second aspect of this halacha is the three levels of lighting the menorah. And the three levels of lighting the menorah are a basic level, one candle each night, just one candle for the whole household. And if somebody can't afford it, they can fulfill the mitzvah that way. However, it is already customary to do one per member of the household, and that would be multiple menorahs if there are multiple members of the household. Additionally, Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin is our custom to also light not only for each member of the household, but also to light an additional candle each day. So one each night, one the first night, two the second night, etc. So these are the this is the structure, and there are relevant halachas for this. The halacha is that ishto kagufo. So if there's a husband and wife in a home, then only one of them needs to light the menorah, and the other will fulfill. So even though that typically we just said that for each member of the household, it's sufficient that you would have a different menorah, each one lighting on their own. But because we have there's a concept of ishta kagufa, a couple are as one, that one lighting would suffice. It's interesting that the Chazal, in enacting this mitzvah of Chanukah, enacted it in such a structure where there's ner ish ubeso, there's a whole household mitzvah, as opposed to the individual, which is the way most mitzvahs are structured. Think of the equivalent of Chanukah would be Purim, where there's also a concept of persume nisa, of doing something public to show the miracles and the protection Hashem gives us. And yet there, it's an individual mitzvah for each person to just light to read the Megillah, or have the Megillah read and listen to it. Why was it by Chanukah that was the unique structure of ner ish ubeso? If we think about the uniqueness of the story of Chanukah, it was that there was a lot of darkness. A lot of people were losing their way within Am Yisrael, within the Jewish people. But there was one person, one family, one household that was willing to stand up for Torah and for mitzvah when everybody else was afraid and shirking back. And this is the concept of Ner Chanukah, Ner Ish Ubeso. A person needs to know that one candle, as long as it's a light, can change the direction of how things are, can illuminate the darkness. One household willing to place the fire of Torah at its forefront and to shine forth to the world is sufficient to change the course direction of history. And so the structure of Ner Chanukah was structured in such a way that it's not only a personal mitzvah, but it's a mitzvah on the household, because that was what started and what ignited the turn back to Torah, the turn back to Judaism and back to the Beis HaMikdash, which eventually led to the miracles of Chanukah. And so this is the structure that Chazal set in this particular mitzvah. The next halacha is, when do you light and for how long do you light? The mitzvah is, the Gemara says, and this is also in Shabbos, in Shabbos 21b, that mitzvasa mishetishka hachama. The mitzvah of lighting the candle is from the time of sunset. Until when? Ad shetichla regel min hashuk. The time of that mitzvah is until the regel, feet, leave the shuk. So what does this mean? Ad shetichla regel min hashuk. Until passerbys would cease, until traffic stops. So in olden times, where people didn't have electricity and ability to have light, as the sun started to go down, people would come into their home, and then the time would end. At some point, and it is estimated in Halacha to be a half hour after this time of Shkia. That's how long people would still be around, and therefore the mitzvah of lighting the candle was for that time. As the Gemara tells us, there are two relevant points of understanding why the Gemara tells us mitzvasa. The mitzvah is from when the sun sets until when passersby, until when traffic stops. One, Di lo adlik madlik, that if one didn't have an opportunity to light at the beginning of the night, meaning when the sun set, they have time until passersby end. And then they can still light because the purpose is persume nisa, to tell the story, to tell the world of the miracles Hashem did for us. And therefore, as long as there are people passing by, you can still fulfill that mitzvah. The other reason the Gemara says, inami l'shi'ura. How long do the candles have to last? So here the Gemara tells us that there are two concepts. One, the time span of the mitzvah, as well as when you should start and up until when is the last point that you can start. So you have to start at sunset, and it should last as long as there are passersby. Now, there's a great debate in Halacha nowadays, where obviously there are people out in the street and out and about much later than it used to be, because we have lights, we have street lights, we have people up to later hours. And so do we have to light the menorah for a longer time so that it can last till as long as there are passersby? That's the one end of this mitzvah. And the other is, if somebody comes home late at night and they ended work late, or they came home late for whatever other reason that they needed to, and they couldn't light at the proper time, so they're only going to be lighting maybe 3-4 hours after sunset. Typically, back when, that would be a time that no one was around in the street anymore, and you could not fulfill the mitzvah of Pirsume Nisa. And there was a question of, you would say a bracha, maybe if there are other members in the household, and you can invite them to stand near you, so you'd fulfill that mitzvah and say the bracha. But it could be that you wouldn't have that, because you wouldn't fulfill the mitzvah because there were no passersby. Nowadays, there are passersby, and so you can fulfill the mitzvah even later on. Nevertheless, the leniency still applies that you only have to have the candles lit for 30 minutes past nightfall. Now, what I said sunset because the Gemara says mishetishka hachama, but it's unclear in halacha as to what point is shkias hachama. We call it at sunset, but actually there are multiple times that are given. There's something called shkia rishona, shkia shnia, and therefore it is appropriate for the candles to be lit approximately somewhere between 20 to 40 minutes after sunset is the optimum time for lighting the menorah. And it should be lit for at least a half hour. Optimally, it should be a half hour after nightfall, after the stars come out. And so you really should have it lit for about 45 minutes. That's the optimum way of lighting the menorah. Because this way you fulfill this Gemara, which says that the time to light it is at Shkia, which we would say is, in Halacha, the poskim say, is the second Shkia, which is about 20 minutes, a half hour after sunset. And then you can have it burn until a half hour post when Shabbos would go out. So when the stars come out. This is relevant for Friday night, because Friday night, obviously, we cannot light the menorah after sunset. So we have to light the menorah before we light the Shabbos candles, which means that you're lighting the menorah 20, 25 minutes prior to sunset. And we just said that there's a second shkia, which is about 20 minutes after sunset, and you want it to be lit for about 45 minutes after that. So you really need a candle that will last at least an hour when you light Friday night. Minimally, it should last 50 minutes. And that being the case, the typical colored candles may not suffice for Friday night. If somebody doesn't have anything else, they should at least light one candle that would last longer than sunset, a half hour past sunset. But the optimum way is to make sure, the correct way is to make sure that you light with a candle or with oil or with and a wick that would last for, from when you light it, at least 45 minutes or an hour after you light the candle, or even more. The optimum way because we're remembering the miracle of the oil in the Beis Hamikdash, the optimum way is to light with oil. If somebody can do that, they have an oil glass cups that they can fill it. Now, you don't have to fill the cup with oil. It is totally fine for the mitzvah to fill it with water and just a little bit of oil at the top. That would be the fuel, as long as it can last this time period that we just said, which is the halachic half hour after night, and so that you fulfill the mitzvah of persume nisa, of telling the story to the passersby as the sun goes down, as nightfall comes. This is the concept of the mitzvah of ad shetichla regel, until the passersby pass by. Any questions about that? Okay, we'll go on. The next Gemara says, Tana Rabbana, Ner Chanukah mitzvah lahanicha al Pesach beisa mebachutz. The structure of the mitzvah and the way they do it in Israel today, for the most part, and the way it was done when it was originally structured, was to light at the front door, and to do so on the opposite side of the mezuzah. So you're encircled by mitzvah. You have the candle on one side and the mezuzah on the other, and you're enveloped by mitzvah, and this is the best way to do it outdoors. However, outside of Eretz Yisrael, the custom is to do it at the window or inside, and this is based on the Gemara. As the Gemara says here, if somebody lives ba'aliyah, somebody lives in an upper floor, manicha b'chalon, then you just put it in the window where people can see, because obviously if you live up on an upper floor and you're going to put it down at the entryway, no one's going to know that it belongs to your house. So your mitzvah is to put it in the window where you can see. And since most people for generations lived in, didn't have their own home, so it had become custom outside of Eretz Yisrael to light it at the window. Additionally, the Gemara says, Ubisha'as hasakana, in a time of danger, and this was a danger where, because of the proximity of Chanukah to other holidays, lighting in for a Jew to illuminate their window with a Jewish holiday was not welcome, and so it became dangerous for Jews to do to light in the window. And so the halacha is manicha al shulchano v'dayo. It's just enough to put it in the table on a counter in the middle of the room, a table in the middle of the room, and the persume nisa, the spreading of the miracle, is just for the family itself, and that would be sufficient. And that's the way it was done for many generations. However, if you do it at home, inside the house, you can also do it at a doorway and do it on the opposite side of the mezuzah. And this way you get the concept of the envelopment of a mitzvah by the mezuzah one side and the other side of the door, the Chanukah menorah, and that's okay. But still, optimally, the optimum way to do it is to put it by a window, as the Gemara has that in the middle level, and it doesn't seem, because it seems the last part of putting it on the table seems to be particularly in a time of danger. It's not clear that in a time that it's not dangerous, like nowadays we live in a place that we are welcome to practice our mitzvos and our Judaism proudly, and therefore there is no need to do it in hiding in the center of the room. You can do it at the window, and that is the optimum persume nisa of spreading the joy and the miracle of Chanukah. Now, the bracha is every mitzvah that we have, we say a bracha. Even though, obviously, this is not a Torah obligation, because Chanukah is a miracle that happened during the time of the second Beis Hamikdash. It's not in the Torah. Nevertheless, we say, Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu. You, Hashem, have commanded us with mitzvahs and sanctified us with mitzvahs and commanded us to light the Chanukah menorah. The reason for this is because the Torah tells us in Parshat Shoftim, the Torah says that you shall listen to the teachings of the Sanhedrin, of the Beis Din, and you shall do all that which they command you. And so we have a mitzvah of lotasir, we have a mitzvah that the Chachamim can enact based on Torah principles. And this is a Torah principle when a miracle happens to Am Yisrael, to enact a time and a celebration. And a part of the celebration is the menorah. And as such, this is a mitzvah sanctified, that Hashem sanctifies us by doing this mitzvah. So this is the Asher Kiddushanu B'mitzvos Havitzivanu Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah. And this teaches us that Hadlaka Osa Mitzvah. That means the mitzvah is structured in such that at the time you light the fire is when you get the moment of the mitzvah. And this has a stringency as well as a leniency. The halachic stringency is that if you didn't have enough wick or candle or oil at the time that you lit the menorah and you added later, that you would have to extinguish it and relight it and make a bracha again. Because if you light, let's say you just have a tiny bit of oil and there isn't enough to burn for a half hour after nightfall, so then you didn't have enough at the time of the mitzvah to fulfill the mitzvah, so it wouldn't count. You have to restart it. That's the concept of that you have to be able to, at the moment that you light it, at the time the mitzvah happens, at the time that you're actually doing it, you have to have enough oil, wick, or candle there in order to last the proper amount of time. There's a leniency as well. If you lit the candle and there was enough for there and somehow it got extinguished, you do not have to relight it because you already did the mitzvah when you lit the candle. So this is the concept of hadlaka osa mitzvah, the time that you lit it does the mitzvah. And therefore, the halacha is that you should have the menorah where you're going to keep it and where it's going to be set for your mitzvah at the time that you light it. Don't light it in one place and then move it to a place that is more optimum for the mitzvah. The second bracha that we have is one of the primary concepts of Chanukah. Because Chanukah is a time of Hallel and Hoda'ah. It's a time of praise and thanksgiving to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the protection and the preservation of Am Yisrael through the generations, through the assimilation and through the oppression from nations, both friend and foe, who have not allowed us or tried to pull us away from the mitzvahs we have and from the mitzvahs we do. This time of celebration, besides for the bracha that every mitzvah we do, we have a bracha for the mitzvah. Almost every mitzvah we do, we have a bracha for the mitzvah. Here, besides for the bracha for the mitzvah, we have another bracha as well. A bracha of hoda'ah, a bracha of praise and thanksgiving to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We say, besides for the bracha the Gemara mentions here, that we quote, it's also she'asad nisim lavosenu, bayamim hahem bazman hazeh. You, Hashem, did miracles for our ancestors in those days at this season, at this time. And we recognize that in times of darkness and in times that it seems like perhaps things aren't going right, that there is no one steering the ship, we recognize that the guiding hand of history, Hashem, who leads us and has led us, will continue to lead us. And we thank Hashem for the miracles of those times and the miracles that be here today. And that mitzvah is a personal mitzvah. It is a very profound part of the mitzvah, that it isn't the lighting of the candle. That really is it's not the bracha for lighting of the candle, but it's the bracha that tells us what the lighting of the candle is about. It's a bracha to thank Hashem for the miracles that we have. And therefore, as we mentioned at the beginning, there's a birchas haroeh. If somebody sees a candle, they don't have their own home, or they're not going to be in a place where they can light by themselves, but they see someone else's candle, so they obviously can't say the bracha that the Gemara tells us here, that the one who lights the candle says, lahalik ner shel Chanukah. You can't say that because that means to light the candle of Chanukah, and obviously not doing that. So therefore, the mitzvah is to state the other bracha, the bracha of praise and thanksgiving to Hashem for the blessings we have and for the miracles that guided us throughout the generations. That bracha is the bracha that even somebody who doesn't light can say. Additionally, the halacha is that if somebody cannot light themselves, whether they are home or not, they can send a messenger, they can send a shaliach to light for them. And they can light in their home and light the candle, even if they're lighting in their own home. So, say somebody is going to be out for the day and they're not going to be able to light the Chanukah menorah, they can call me and say, hey, Tzvi, can you go over to my home? And after you light your own candles, come and light my candles in my house. This way, my home, I fulfill the mitzvah, even though that I can't light it, but you can light it for me in my home because I'm going to come home too late or whatever it may be. The halacha is I can do that as a shaliach. However, I can only say the second bracha, the bracha of praise and thanksgiving for the miracles, she'asani sim lavasenu, only if the person is standing with me when I light for them, such as if they can't light on their own, or if they don't know the blessings and they want me to do it for them, then I can do it for them and say both blessings, because the second blessing is not a blessing on the candles. It's a blessing on the moment, and that's a mitzvah of praise giving and thanksgiving on each individual person. And that I can't do for someone else unless they're there to hear the bracha and fulfill it when I say it. Any questions on that? Now, as we mentioned before, this is a mitzvah on each person and on each household. So Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi says, although this is a time-bound mitzvah, which generally time-bound mitzvahs are obligations on men and women are exempt, here, Nashim Chayavas B'ner Chanukah. Women are equally obligated in the mitzvah of Chanukah, because they too were a part of this miracle. They were a part of the instigation and the winning and the beating of the Greeks and winning back the Beis Hamikdash. And so the mitzvah is structured in a way that each individual in the household, male, woman, man, woman, and child, are obligated in this mitzvah. As we mentioned, as a couple are one, so then they only have to light one. But for all other members of the household, or if there's a woman living alone, or multiple people living in a household, but the woman is single, then she would light as well, because the mitzvah is on each individual in the household, and particularly if she's the head of the household, then the mitzvah is upon her to light, and the mitzvah is each individual person, including the women. And a woman can be a shaliach, can light for somebody else. And what's relevant here is, we mentioned earlier that the halacha is that the optimum time for lighting the menorah is about 20 minutes, half hour after sunset, and it should last until nightfall. That's because ideally you should do it when people are around and there are passersby, and in the times of before electricity, when people didn't have lights, they didn't go out, and so passersby would cease to be on the street once nightfall came, or a half hour after night. Nowadays, obviously, as we mentioned then, you can extend that because people do pass by, and there are people walking around, people walking dogs, people are just taking a walk, even later at night. And so the time for the mitzvah is extended, but the optimum time is right at the beginning of the day, right at the beginning of the night. And so if somebody's not going to come home from work, if somebody's working out of the house, one of the few people that do work out of the house nowadays, right? And so they're working out of the house and they're not going to make it back home until past nightfall or much later. So ideally, someone in the household should light at the proper time on their behalf. And when they come home, they can light again, either without a bracha, if there was intention to fulfill the mitzvah for them, or with a bracha if whoever lit earlier specifically intended not to fulfill the mitzvah for them, so that when they can come home, they can light on their own. However, it needs to be very sensitive, and people need to understand whether this is going to cause friction in the home, where if somebody's out late for work and then they miss the family lighting and they're going to feel badly about it, so then it is best to wait until everyone's there to light together. But if it's such a scenario where it's understood and both parties are comfortable with one lighting at the proper time and the other coming home later, then that should be done so. And obviously, as we see in the Gemara here, it's a mitzvah on both the men and women. And so regardless of which one it is, whether the husband is home and the wife is coming home late, or the wife is home and the husband's coming home late, even though we said earlier that they fulfill the mitzvah for each other, if one is going to be away at that time, they can fulfill the mitzvah. They can either make the other, the shaliach, to light for them, or they can say, please light for the household and don't intend to fulfill the mitzvah for me. And when I come home, I will light on my own as well. And this is typically if somebody is traveling for business, is coming home late, or in whatever it may be, and they won't be able to be home, but want the family to be able to be together. Maybe they're going to come home after the children go to sleep, and this way the children will be able to light with whoever is home. So these are scenarios where it would be appropriate to try and light earlier, even though someone is going to miss that mitzvah. And when they come home, they'll be able to light again. The next halacha that we talked about, and something we mentioned, is that the mitzvah is on each person as well as the household. So if somebody's not going to be home, they are a guest in someone else's home, they have their own obligation of lighting the menorah, either at home or where they go. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes said, Achsanai, a guest living in someone else's house, Chayev b'ner Chanukah, they're obligated in their own mitzvah of Chanukah. If they have their own designated space, whether it's their own room, their own bed, they would have to light the menorah as well. They could fulfill that obligation by participating in the host's menorah. They can say to the host, look, you're putting in enough oil. I want to participate. Here's a coin, $1, whatever it may be, to be a partner in your oil. And this way, when you light, you're lighting for me as well. That's one way. Or they can light their own menorah. And a guest can do that. So the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Zera said that at first, when he would go to study at the academy, what he would participate by giving a coin to whoever his host was. However, once he got married and his wife was lighting at home, he didn't need to do that anymore, because his fulfillment of the mitzvah was fulfilled by his wife lighting in his house, even though that he wasn't there and he wasn't going to be there that night. But because the mitzvah is ner ish ubeso, on each individual and the household had it, and his wife, as his representative, also had lit, so he did not have to light wherever he was a guest. And this is the concept that we spoke about before of the ability to have someone light on your behalf, and the mitzvah, the structure of the mitzvah being such that you light at the household level as well as the individual level. So what we spoke about, the mitzvah is on each individual, the mitzvah is on the household, the mitzvah can be fulfilled by a shaliach, by someone doing it for you. The concept of the mitzvah is to remind us of the miracles, and so we have a special bracha for Hashem's guiding hand in the nisim, in the miracles, as well as that the allotted time is at least a half hour after nightfall. And for Friday night, you need a lot of fuel because you're starting before candle lighting Friday night, and so therefore it is appropriate to have whatever you use, candles or oil, with enough fuel to be able to burn at least a half hour after nightfall. Since there's an obligation to daven mincha and ma'ariv prior to lighting of the candles, because the time of lighting of the candles and the time of ma'ariv come at the same time, and there's a concept in halacha, tadir v'she'eno tadir, tadir kodem. Whatever is a constant and then you have a mitzvah that's a not that comes from time to time is not constant. So the mitzvah that is constant is done first. So at the same time that you have an obligation to light the Chanukah menorah, you also have an obligation, or there is an obligation for men to daven mariv, to daven the evening tefillah, and therefore they come at the same time. And so if a man is lighting the menorah, they would first daven mariv, which is the constant mitzvah, and then only after that would they light the Chanukah menorah. The part of the praise, the shevach and hoda'ah, the praise and thanksgiving that we have on this Chag, on Chanukah, is in the Amida, in the tefillah that we say, as well as in benching in Birkat HaMazon. We say in the third to last bracha, in the second to last bracha, in Hoda'ah, in Modim. At the end of Modim, we say Al Hanisim, as well as in the second bracha of Birkat HaMazon, of benching, we say no, in No Delacha, which is also about Thanksgiving. In there we insert Al Hanisim and the section for Chanukah, which thanks Hashem for the miracles. And this is a primary aspect of the Chag, of the holiday, in order to include the thanksgiving and Shevach to Hashem for this, for these miracles and for the guiding hand in history. However, as opposed to some other times where if you forget the insertion for the day, you would have to repeat whether it's davening or benching. That's because there's an obligation specific to that Chag. However, on Chanukah, you don't have to have a festive meal. You don't have to wash and eat bread. And there isn't a specific tefillah for Chanukah. And therefore, if you missed Al Hanisim, you would not repeat the Amida, and you would not repeat benching. Additionally, there is a mitzvah every day to say Hallel. There is a discussion and a debate in Halacha whether this applies to women, an obligation to women as well. Because generally we say Hallel is a time-bound mitzvah, which women are exempt. However, with Hanukkah, as we mentioned earlier, the mitzvah of the candles is both for men and women. And therefore, perhaps the Hallel is an obligation for men and women as well. So it is important for everybody to try and say Hallel every day of Hanukkah with the bracha. The obligation is anytime during the daytime, and to say Hallel, and it's the complete Hallel, not only not the half Hallel, which is said on Rosh Chodesh or on Chalamot Pesach. There are also customs about foods, as you know, and there are particular halachos that pertain to the foods. There are brachos questions as well as kashrus questions. One point I would like to make that is important, that when there is a halacha of a sharp food, when it's cut with a dairy or meat knife, that sharp food takes on the status of whether it is dairy or meat, whichever knife you used. And so if you make latkes and you're using, for your onions, you're using a grater or a knife that is dairy or meat, and your meal is the opposite, then that would not be eaten in the same meal. So if you want to have sour cream with your latkes, don't use a fleishik knife, don't use a meat knife to cut the onions for the latkes. And if you're serving a latkes in a meat meal, don't use a dairy knife for the onion. And this is a irrelevant halacha that comes up on occasion like this because of the particular food style that we have around Hanukkah, where the latkes can sometimes be served in a meat meal, and sometimes you're going to eat it with sour cream, so it's dairy, and so you have to know that the sharps, the onions used in that food should be made with either a parv knife or the type of, or you're cutting the onion with a particular knife of the food that you're going to eat for that particular meal. Any questions?
Yes, Rabbi, I may have missed this. You may have stated something about you can't you can't you can't say Mariv before on a Friday night before lighting a Chanukah, right? I mean that.
Right, correct. Okay, so Michael's asking a great question. I said that the mitzvah of Hanukkah and the candles and the mitzvah of Mariv come at the same time, and so the constant is the one that you're going to say, which is Mariv, and then light the candles. But obviously, as Michael is pointing out, that's good for every other night. It's not so for Friday night because you're going to take in Shabbos, and at that point you can't light the Hanukkah candles anymore. So you would have to light the Hanukkah candles before the Shabbos candles, before Shabbos comes in. And so Friday night, indeed, the lighting of the Hanukkah candles will be done way before its proper time, and only on account of because that's the latest time we can light the candles that night. So you light the Hanukkah candles, you light the Shabbos candles, and then you go to daven. It is customary, however, to daven mincha on Shabbos Hanukkah prior to lighting the Shabbos candle, the Hanukkah candles, and so mincha on a Friday, on this Friday, would be done earlier in the day, customarily. And as Tuvia is asking about Motzei Shabbos, there are two opinions of whether one should do Havdalah first or light Hanukkah candles first. Generally, we would say Tadir v'she'eno tadir. What's a constant? And Havdalah is definitely a more constant than the Hanukkah menorah, and therefore you should say Havdalah first. That's what one would think. However, there are those that say that you would actually do the Hanukkah candles first, and this is the way you do it in shul for sure. Everybody agrees that you do in shul first the Hanukkah menorah and then Havdalah. And so the reason for that is because in Mariv, in the evening tefillah of Motzei Shabbos, after Shabbos, you already say Havdalah in the Amida. And there's a special insertion for Havdalah, as well as people that aren't going to daven Mariv will also say Havdalah by saying Baruch HaMavdil Ben Kadosh HaChol, blessed are you Hashem, who separates from holy and mundane to mundane. And so once you've already stated a Havdalah, now you fulfill that concept already, and the mitzvah of Ner Hanukkah would come first. It is our family's custom to light candles, Hanukkah candles first, and then do Havdalah. There are definitely those that have the custom to do Havdalah first and then light the Hanukkah candles. Either way is valid from a halachic perspective. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for joining. And I wish you a wonderful Hanukkah, Hanukkah that is illuminating, that the spirit and the idea of Hanukkah, of recognizing Hashem's hand guiding us through even the darkest moments to bring us to a place of closeness and light, where we can be the one who illuminates for Hashem in this world by doing the good deeds and showing the world that there is light, there is goodness, and that the goodness will overpower and overcome all the darkness. I hope indeed that we can see it speedily in our days.